Video 2, Hermeneutics 101, Eschatology. Learning how to think about the Bible. Literal or symbolic? Understanding prophetic language. Big idea. Before deciding whether a passage should be read literally or symbolically, we must first determine how the biblical author intended to communicate. Introduction. If I told you that a beast rises out of the sea, what would you expect to see? If I told you that the sun grows dark, the moon refuses to give its light, and the stars fall from heaven, what would you expect that language to mean? If I told you that Yeshua is a door, would you expect wood and hinges? At first, those questions may seem unrelated, but they all force us to wrestle with the same issue. How is the author communicating? In our previous study, we learned that sincere believers often arrive at different conclusions because they bring different assumptions to Scripture. Most Christians are convinced they simply read the Bible and believe what it says. Yet when discussions turn toward prophecy, disagreements often appear very quickly. People disagree about the kingdom. They disagree about the beast. They disagree about Babylon. They disagree about the millennium. They disagree about the timing of prophetic events and even the meaning of entire passages. Why? Part of the answer is that people bring assumptions into the text. But another part of the answer is that people often approach prophetic language without first asking how the prophets actually communicated. Many discussions begin with a question that sounds perfectly reasonable. Should this passage be interpreted literally or symbolically? Entire systems of interpretation have been built upon how that question is answered. Some people pride themselves on taking prophecy literally. Others emphasize symbolism. Before long, camps are formed, positions become entrenched, and debates begin. But what if that is not the first question we should ask? What if the better question is, how is the author communicating? That question forces us to slow down. It forces us to observe before concluding. It forces us to pay attention to context. Most importantly, it forces us to focus on authorial intent rather than our own assumptions. Imagine receiving a letter from someone you deeply love and respect. You would not begin by asking what you want the letter to mean. You would ask what the author intended to communicate. You would pay attention to the words, the context, the purpose, and the message. The same principle applies to Scripture. The goal of interpretation is not discovering what a passage means to me, to you, or to anyone else. The goal is discovering what the author intended to communicate. Throughout this entire series, you are going to hear me repeat the same statement because I believe it lies at the heart of sound hermeneutics. I don't care what it means to me, you, or anyone else. I want to know what it meant to the man who wrote it. That principle becomes especially important when we enter the world of prophecy. Many of the debates surrounding Daniel, Revelation, the beast, Babylon, cosmic signs, and end times events begin before those subjects are ever discussed. They begin with assumptions about language. Before we start debating symbols, kingdoms, timelines, and prophetic systems, we need to learn something more basic. We need to learn how biblical prophets communicate. And once we understand that, we will be far better equipped to evaluate the conclusions people draw from prophetic texts. Chapter 1. The prophets often spoke in pictures. One of the first things you discover when reading the prophets is that they frequently communicate through imagery. This should not surprise us, although modern readers sometimes find it unusual. We tend to communicate through explanations, definitions, bullet points, and carefully organized arguments. The prophets often communicated through visions, symbols, signs, and vivid word pictures. Rather than merely telling people something, they often painted a picture in the minds of their audience. Think about some of the major prophets of Scripture. Isaiah records visions of heavenly glory and future judgment. Ezekiel describes living creatures, wheels within wheels, a valley full of dry bones, and a future temple. Daniel sees strange beasts rising from the sea and kingdoms represented through unusual imagery. Zechariah sees lampstands, olive trees, horses, and flying scrolls. John fills Revelation with dragons, beasts, stars, lampstands, scrolls, trumpets, and heavenly scenes. At this stage, we are not trying to determine exactly how every image should be interpreted. We are simply making an observation. The prophets frequently communicated through pictures, and it was not limited to visions. Sometimes the prophets themselves became part of the message. Jeremiah was instructed to place a yoke upon his neck as a sign concerning Babylon's coming authority, Jeremiah 27:2-11. The yoke itself was not the message. The yoke communicated the message. It was a visible illustration pointing toward a coming reality. Ezekiel provides some of the most dramatic examples in all of Scripture. He built a model of Jerusalem, lay on his side for extended periods of time, divided his hair into portions, and performed other symbolic actions designed to communicate Yahovah's message to Israel. The actions themselves pointed beyond themselves. They functioned as living illustrations. Isaiah also participated in symbolic actions that served as signs to the people, Isaiah 20:2-4. Again, the action was not the ultimate point. The action communicated the point. What should we learn from all of this? We should learn that symbolic communication is not some strange exception found in a handful of difficult passages. It is woven throughout the prophetic writings. The prophets often communicated truth through pictures, and that naturally raises an important question. If prophets regularly communicated through imagery, visions, signs, symbols, and dramatic actions, how were their audiences expected to understand them? Were symbols merely invitations to speculation? Could they mean whatever seemed right to the reader? Or does Scripture itself provide a pattern for understanding prophetic imagery? That question brings us directly to the heart of this lesson. If prophetic imagery is common throughout Scripture, then the next question becomes obvious. How are symbols meant to be understood? And as we are about to discover, the Bible often gives us the answer itself. Chapter 2. Symbols are meant to be understood. One of the reasons prophecy can feel intimidating is because symbols often make a passage seem mysterious. The moment a reader encounters a beast, a horn, a lampstand, a dragon, or some other unusual image, it is easy to assume that understanding has suddenly become impossible. Some readers respond by giving up altogether. Others go in the opposite direction and immediately begin assigning meanings to everything they see. The lion means this, the bear means that. The horns represent something else. Before long, speculation begins running wild. But when we slow down and pay attention to how Scripture actually handles symbolic language, we discover something very important. The Bible does not present symbols as barriers to understanding. More often than not, symbols are tools of communication. They are given so that truth can be revealed, not concealed. Let me show you what I mean. Most people do not think of Genesis when discussing prophetic symbolism, but one of the clearest examples in all of Scripture appears there. You probably remember the story. Pharaoh has a dream that troubles him deeply. He sees 7 healthy cows come up from the river, followed by 7 thin and sickly cows. Then he sees 7 healthy heads of grain, followed by 7 withered heads of grain. The dream leaves him unsettled because he knows it matters. He knows it means something. But he has no idea what he is looking at. Now put yourself in Pharaoh's position for a moment. If someone asked you what the cows represented, how would you know? If someone asked you what the grain represented, where would you even begin? The imagery is vivid, but the meaning is not immediately obvious. The dream requires interpretation. Then Joseph arrives, and something important happens. Joseph does not invent a theory. He does not speculate. He does not offer a list of possibilities. Instead, he interprets the imagery. Suddenly, the dream begins to make sense. Joseph tells Pharaoh, "The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years." Genesis 41:26. Think carefully about what just happened. The cows were symbolic. The years were literal. The grain was symbolic. The years were literal. The dream communicated a real future event through symbolic imagery. The symbols pointed beyond themselves to reality. That principle is foundational for understanding prophetic language. Now let's move from Genesis to one of the most important prophetic passages in the entire Bible, Daniel chapter 7. Imagine opening Daniel chapter 7 for the very first time. You have never attended a prophecy conference. You have never watched a YouTube debate. You have never listened to a sermon series on Daniel. All you have is the text sitting in front of you. As you read, Daniel sees 4 strange beasts rising out of the sea. The first resembles a lion, the second resembles a bear, the third resembles a leopard. The fourth is so terrifying and unusual that Daniel struggles to describe it. If you are anything like me, your mind immediately starts asking questions. What does the lion mean? What does the bear mean? What does the leopard mean? What is the fourth beast? And this is where something extremely important happens. Daniel does not simply invent answers. He does not start constructing theories. He does not force the symbols into a system. Instead, he seeks understanding, and understanding is provided. Daniel records, "Those great beasts, which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth." Daniel 7:17. Later we are told, "The fourth beast shall be a 4th kingdom on earth." Daniel 7:23. Notice the pattern. Daniel sees a symbol. Then he receives an explanation. The beast is not the kingdom. The beast represents the kingdom. The symbol points beyond itself to a reality that the vision is communicating. And that is exactly what we saw in Pharaoh's dream. The imagery communicates reality. The symbol carries meaning. The symbol does not eliminate understanding. The symbol delivers understanding. This is one of the most important hermeneutical lessons in all of Scripture. The Bible is not encouraging us to invent meanings. The Bible is teaching us to seek the meaning intended by the author. And once you begin noticing this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Daniel chapter 8 follows the same process. Daniel sees a ram with 2 horns and later sees a male goat charging across the earth. Once again, readers could easily begin speculating about what these images represent. But Scripture does not leave us entirely on our own. Daniel is told, "The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece." Daniel 8:20-21. Once again, symbol, interpretation, understanding. The Bible is modeling a process. Observe the imagery, seek understanding, allow interpretation to arise from the text itself, and the pattern continues all the way into the New Testament. When many people think about symbolic language, Revelation is usually the first book that comes to mind. Yet even there, we find the same principle at work. In Revelation chapter 1, John sees 7 lampstands and 7 stars. Imagine encountering those symbols without any explanation. Readers could speculate endlessly about what they might represent. But that is not what happens. The interpretation is supplied. John is told, "The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands which you saw are the 7 churches." Revelation 1:20. Again, the symbol points beyond itself. The imagery communicates a reality. Notice something important. In every example we have examined, the symbol did not eliminate meaning. The symbol carried meaning. The symbol did not create confusion. The symbol communicated truth. Now, before we move forward, I want to make an important clarification. I am not suggesting that every symbol in Scripture comes with a neat definition attached to it. Sometimes the interpretation is explicit, as it is in Genesis 41, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Revelation 1. Other times, the meaning becomes clear through context, recurring biblical themes, and the way imagery is used throughout Scripture. But the larger principle remains the same. Scripture frequently provides the interpretive framework necessary to understand its imagery. That observation leads us to an important hermeneutics checkpoint. When you encounter a symbol in Scripture, what is your first instinct? Do you immediately assign it a meaning? Do you assume you already know what it represents? Or do you stop and ask some important questions? Has Scripture already defined this image? Where else does this image appear? What clues does the context provide? How is the author using it here? Those questions are far more valuable than speculation, because our goal is not to impose meaning upon the text. Our goal is to discover the meaning the author intended to communicate. And that brings us to another misunderstanding that causes confusion for many readers. Some people assume that if language is symbolic, it somehow becomes less true. But Scripture repeatedly demonstrates the exact opposite. If the examples we have just examined teach us anything, they teach us that symbols often point beyond themselves to something real. And once we understand that principle, we are ready to address one of the most common misunderstandings in all of biblical interpretation, the idea that symbolic language somehow makes truth less true. Chapter 3. Symbolic language can communicate literal truth. One of the most common misunderstandings people bring to prophecy is the assumption that symbolic language somehow makes a statement less true. Most people would never say that out loud, but many interpret Scripture as though that were the case. In their minds, literal language belongs in the category of reality, while symbolic language belongs in the category of imagination. Literal means factual. Symbolic means figurative. Literal means true. Symbolic means less true. As a result, whenever symbolism appears in Scripture, some readers instinctively begin treating the passage as though it has somehow moved further away from reality. But that is not how the Bible communicates. In fact, some of the most profound truths in all of Scripture are communicated through symbolism. Think about some of the language Yeshua used during his earthly ministry. At one point he said, "I am the door." John 10:9. Now imagine someone hearing those words and insisting that they must be interpreted in the most woodenly literal way possible. Immediately, the statement becomes absurd. No one listening to Yeshua thought he was claiming to be made of wood. No one imagined hinges attached to his shoulders. No one pictured him standing inside a doorframe. Yet no Christian concludes that his statement was false. Why? Because everyone instinctively recognizes that symbolic language is being used to communicate a real truth. Yeshua is teaching that access to salvation comes through him. The language is symbolic. The truth is literal. The same thing happens when Yeshua says, "I am the vine, you are the branches." John 15:5. Again, no one imagines that Yeshua transformed into a grapevine. No one imagines that his disciples became wooden branches growing from a plant. Yet everyone understands the reality being communicated. Yeshua is teaching about dependence, life, nourishment, connection, and relationship. The imagery points beyond itself to something real. Then consider one of the most famous titles ever given to Messiah. John the Baptist sees Yeshua approaching and declares, "Behold, the Lamb of Yahovah who takes away the sin of the world." John 1:29. That statement is loaded with meaning. It immediately calls our minds back to sacrifice. It reminds us of Passover. It points toward redemption, deliverance, and atonement. Yet no believer imagines that John was literally identifying Yeshua as a wool-covered animal standing in a field. Once again, symbolic language is communicating literal truth. And once we recognize this principle, something important begins to happen. We stop asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, "Is this symbolic or real?" we begin asking, "What real thing is this symbol communicating?" That is a much better question, and it is exactly how Scripture often functions. Think back to the examples we examined in the previous chapter. Pharaoh's cows were symbolic. The coming years of abundance and famine were real. Daniel's beasts were symbolic. The kingdoms they represented were real. The ram and the goat were symbolic. The empires they represented were real. The lampstands in Revelation were symbolic. The churches they represented were real. In every example, the symbol pointed beyond itself. The symbol was not the destination. The symbol was the signpost. The reality was always larger than the image itself. I think that is one of the reasons symbolism can be such a powerful teaching tool. Symbols often communicate truths that would be difficult to express through a simple definition. A symbol can carry layers of meaning, connections, and associations that help the audience understand a reality more deeply than a straightforward statement might accomplish on its own. In fact, much of Scripture functions this way. Think about the Passover lamb. Think about the sacrificial system. Think about the tabernacle. Think about the priesthood. Again and again, physical realities point beyond themselves to greater spiritual realities. The visible points toward the invisible. The symbol points toward the truth. Now, before we move forward, we need to establish an important balance. Recognizing symbolism does not mean that everything becomes symbolic. This is where some interpreters drive into the opposite ditch. Sometimes a lamb is symbolic. Sometimes a lamb is simply a lamb. Sometimes a mountain carries symbolic significance. Sometimes a mountain is simply a mountain. Sometimes a king represents something larger. Sometimes a king is simply a king. The presence of symbolism in Scripture does not give us permission to turn every passage into an allegory. And this brings us right back to one of the most important principles in this entire series. Context determines meaning. Authorial intent determines meaning. Not our imagination, not our preferences, not our traditions, the author's intended meaning. The goal is not becoming a person who sees symbols everywhere. The goal is not becoming a person who refuses to see symbols anywhere. The goal is learning to recognize how the author intended the language to function. And this becomes especially important when we realize how easily sincere people can misunderstand figurative language. In fact, some of the clearest examples of this problem are found in the ministry of Yeshua himself. If determining how an author is communicating is so important, then we should not be surprised to discover that even sincere listeners sometimes misunderstood Yeshua's words. And when we examine those misunderstandings, we learn an important lesson about the dangers of assuming the wrong type of communication. Chapter 4. When people misunderstand figurative language. Up to this point, we have established several important principles. We have seen that the prophets often communicated through imagery. We have seen that Scripture frequently provides interpretive guidance. We have seen that symbolic language can communicate literal truth. Now we arrive at a practical question. What happens when people misunderstand the type of language that is being used? The answer is simple. They misunderstand the message. One of the most fascinating observations in the Gospels is how often this happened during the ministry of Yeshua. Again and again, people heard his words correctly but misunderstood his meaning. The problem was not that they were incapable of hearing. The problem was not necessarily a lack of intelligence. The problem was that they assumed the wrong kind of communication. One of the clearest examples appears in John chapter 3. Yeshua tells Nicodemus, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of Yahovah." John 3:3. Now put yourself in Nicodemus's position for a moment. Imagine hearing those words for the very first time. You have never heard a sermon on being born again. You have never listened to a Bible study explaining the passage. All you hear is Yeshua telling a grown man that he must be born again. Nicodemus immediately begins processing the statement in a physical sense. How can a grown man be born again? How can someone enter his mother's womb a second time? How is such a thing even possible? The statement sounds absurd because Nicodemus is hearing it through a physical lens, but Yeshua is not talking about a second physical birth at all. He is speaking about spiritual rebirth. The misunderstanding occurs because Nicodemus assumes one type of communication, while Yeshua intends another. The words were heard correctly. The meaning was misunderstood. A very similar event occurs in John chapter 4. Yeshua meets a Samaritan woman at a well and begins speaking with her about living water. He tells her, "Whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst." John 4:14. Again, imagine hearing those words for the first time. The woman immediately begins thinking about physical water. Her mind goes straight to the well standing before her. She imagines relief from the daily burden of drawing water. If Yeshua can somehow provide water that permanently satisfies thirst, perhaps she will never need to return to the well again. But Yeshua is speaking about something much greater. He is speaking about spiritual life. Once again, the misunderstanding occurs because the hearer assumes one type of communication while the speaker intends another. Now, before we continue, I want you to notice something important. Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman are making exactly the same mistake. They are hearing the words through the wrong interpretive lens. They assume physical communication when Yeshua intends something deeper. And because they begin with the wrong assumption, everything that follows becomes confusing. The same pattern appears again in Matthew chapter 16. Yeshua warns his disciples, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Matthew 16:6. Immediately, the disciples begin discussing bread. They assume Yeshua is rebuking them because they forgot to bring provisions for the journey. In their minds, leaven equals bread, and therefore the conversation must be about food. But that is not what Yeshua is talking about at all. Later, the disciples realized that he was speaking about the teaching and doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees, Matthew 16:12. Once again, the words were heard correctly. The meaning was misunderstood. The problem was not hearing. The problem was interpretation. Perhaps one of the most striking examples appears in John chapter 2. Yeshua declares, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." John 2:19. The people listening immediately think about the physical temple in Jerusalem. Their response makes perfect sense if that is the subject under discussion. The temple had taken decades to build. How could anyone possibly rebuild it in 3 days? Yet John later explains, "But he was speaking of the temple of his body." John 2:21. Once again, sincere listeners misunderstood the statement because they assumed the wrong mode of communication, and this is exactly why these examples matter. They reveal something about human nature. We often assume we already know how a statement should be understood. We hear familiar words and immediately begin assigning familiar meanings. We bring assumptions into the conversation without even realizing it. Sometimes those assumptions help us. Other times, they lead us completely in the wrong direction. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it is exactly what we discussed in video 1. People bring assumptions to Scripture, and when it comes to prophecy, assumptions about language can dramatically influence interpretation. If I automatically assume a symbol must be interpreted literally, I may misunderstand the author's intention. If I automatically assume a symbol must be interpreted symbolically, I may misunderstand the author's intention. Either way, I have allowed my assumptions to take control of the interpretation. The better approach is to slow down, observe carefully, pay attention to context, ask questions, determine how the author is communicating before deciding what the statement means. That principle applies to the teachings of Yeshua. It applies to the prophets, and it applies to the book of Revelation. As we continue, another important question naturally arises. If prophetic imagery appears throughout Scripture, do biblical authors tend to use certain images repeatedly? The answer is yes, and recognizing those recurring patterns can help us become much better readers of prophecy. As we move through the prophets, we begin noticing that certain images appear again and again. The same themes, the same patterns, the same kinds of language, and one of the clearest examples involves the repeated use of the sun, moon, and stars. Chapter 5. Learning the language of the prophets. As we read through the prophets, one of the things we begin noticing is that certain images appear repeatedly. The same kinds of language show up in different books, written by different authors, living in different periods of history. This does not automatically mean that every occurrence carries exactly the same meaning. We must remember the principle we have already established. Context determines meaning. Nevertheless, recurring imagery is important because it teaches us something about how biblical authors often communicate. Think about what happens when you move to a new country and begin learning a new language. At first, certain words and expressions seem unfamiliar. You hear them repeatedly, but you do not fully understand how they are being used. Over time, however, patterns begin to emerge. The more examples you encounter, the more comfortable you become with the language itself. Eventually, you begin recognizing phrases and expressions almost instinctively because you have seen them used so many times. Something similar happens when we read the prophets. The more prophetic literature we read, the more we begin noticing recurring themes, recurring imagery, and recurring patterns of communication. We begin learning the language of the prophets. One of the clearest examples involves cosmic imagery. Again and again, we encounter references to the sun, moon, stars, heavens, and the shaking of the earth. Consider Isaiah chapter 13. In a prophecy concerning Babylon, Isaiah writes, "For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine." Isaiah 13:10. Now, if this were the only place such language appeared, we might simply note it and move on, but then we continue reading. In Ezekiel chapter 32, in a prophecy concerning Egypt, we find remarkably similar language. I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. Ezekiel 32:7. Again, we keep reading. Then we arrive at Joel chapter 2. The sun and moon will grow dark, and the stars will diminish their brightness. Joel 2:10. By now, a pattern is beginning to emerge. Then we come to the words of Yeshua in Matthew chapter 24. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven. Matthew 24:29. And finally, when we arrive in Revelation chapter 6, we encounter similar imagery once again. Now, I want to be very careful here. The purpose of this lesson is not to determine exactly how each of these passages should be interpreted. That discussion belongs elsewhere. The purpose of this lesson is simply to observe something. The imagery reoccurs. The language appears repeatedly throughout Scripture, and that observation teaches us an important hermeneutical principle. When we encounter prophetic imagery, one of the most valuable questions we can ask is, where have I seen this before? That question can often provide more insight than immediately running to a commentary, searching online, or listening to someone's prophetic theory. Because Scripture frequently helps interpret Scripture, biblical authors often build upon imagery that appears earlier in Scripture. Themes develop, patterns develop, language develops. Images that appear in one book often reappear in another. Now let me add an important caution. Recurring imagery does not automatically prove identical meaning. Just because similar language appears in multiple passages does not mean every author is making the exact same point in the exact same way. Context still matters. Audience still matters. Purpose still matters. The recurring imagery does not eliminate the need for careful interpretation. It simply tells us that the imagery deserves investigation. And that is an important distinction. We are not looking for shortcuts. We are learning how to ask better questions. This is one reason prophecy sometimes feels difficult to modern readers. Ancient readers were often far more familiar with the earlier scriptures than many modern readers are today. They recognized allusions. They recognized recurring themes. They recognized imagery that had appeared before. They were accustomed to hearing the prophets communicate through this kind of language. Modern readers sometimes approach a passage in Revelation and assume they are encountering an image for the first time. Often they are not. The image may already have a long history within the Scriptures, and that observation leads us directly into another important principle. The final book of the Bible did not appear in a vacuum. In many ways, Revelation assumes familiarity with everything that came before it. If biblical authors frequently build upon earlier imagery, then nowhere is that principle more important than in the book of Revelation. To understand how John communicates, we must first understand the symbolic vocabulary that was already present in the scriptures he knew and loved. Chapter 6. Revelation's Old Testament vocabulary. When many people begin studying biblical prophecy, they naturally gravitate toward the book of Revelation. That is understandable. Revelation contains some of the most dramatic imagery in the entire Bible. Beasts rise from the sea, dragons wage war, trumpets sound, seals are opened, bowls of judgment are poured out. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven. The book captures the imagination in a way that few other books of Scripture do. But one of the most important observations we can make about Revelation is that John did not invent most of his imagery. That statement may surprise some people at first, but the more you read the Scriptures, the more obvious it becomes. In many ways, Revelation is the culmination of themes, patterns, images, and symbols that have already appeared throughout the Bible. John is not creating an entirely new symbolic language. He is drawing from a vocabulary that already exists within the Scriptures. Think about it this way. Imagine walking into the middle of a conversation that has already been going on for an hour. People are referencing earlier statements, previous events, shared experiences, and familiar ideas. To the people who have been there from the beginning, everything makes perfect sense. But to the person who arrived late, much of the conversation feels confusing because the earlier context is missing. Something similar can happen when we approach Revelation. If we know Revelation but do not know the law, the prophets, and the writings, we may find ourselves entering the conversation halfway through. This does not mean Revelation cannot be understood. It means Revelation often expects its readers to be familiar with what came before. Consider just a few examples. When John describes beasts, our minds should immediately begin thinking about Daniel. When John describes heavenly visions filled with unusual imagery, Ezekiel should come to mind. When lampstands appear, Zechariah becomes relevant. When plagues and judgments unfold, Exodus echoes throughout the narrative. When themes involving serpents, dragons, deception, and conflict emerge, our minds naturally move back toward Genesis. The point is not that every image means exactly the same thing in every context. The point is that the imagery has a history. It has a background. It has roots. And those roots often help us understand how biblical authors communicate. This is one reason I believe one of the best habits a student of prophecy can develop is learning to read Revelation with an open Bible. Not merely reading Revelation alongside Genesis, reading Revelation alongside Exodus, reading Revelation alongside Isaiah, reading Revelation alongside Ezekiel, reading Revelation alongside Daniel, reading Revelation alongside Zechariah. The more familiar we become with those books, the more familiar Revelation begins to feel. And that observation leads us back to one of the central themes of this lesson. When we encounter an image in Scripture, our first question should not be, "What does this mean to me?" Nor should our first question be, "What does my favorite teacher say it means?" A better question is, "Where have I seen this imagery before?" That question encourages us to let Scripture interpret Scripture. It encourages us to trace themes. It encourages us to follow patterns. It encourages us to pay attention to context. And perhaps most importantly, it encourages us to enter the world of the biblical author rather than forcing the biblical author into ours. Because that is what hermeneutics is ultimately about. Not making the text fit our assumptions, discovering what the author intended to communicate. And as we prepare to conclude this lesson, there is one final warning we need to consider. Because in every area of biblical interpretation, there are ditches on both sides of the road. Prophecy is no exception. If we are going to read prophetic literature responsibly, we must learn to avoid two opposite mistakes. One mistake ignores symbolism where it exists. The other sees symbolism where it does not exist. And both can pull us away from the author's intended meaning. Chapter 7. Avoiding the two ditches. As we come to the end of this lesson, I want to leave you with two warnings. Over the years, I have noticed that many prophecy discussions eventually drift into one of two ditches. These ditches sit on opposite sides of the road, but both can lead interpreters away from sound conclusions. The first ditch is over-literalizing. This happens when readers assume that every image must be interpreted in the most woodenly literal way possible. Every beast becomes a literal beast. Every symbol becomes a physical object. Every vision becomes something resembling a photograph. The interpreter becomes so committed to literalism that he loses sight of the fact that the prophets often communicated through imagery. But Scripture itself does not encourage that approach. Daniel's beasts were not zoological predictions. Pharaoh's cows were not primarily about livestock. The lampstands in Revelation were not merely decorative furniture. Yeshua was not literally a wooden door. In each case, the imagery pointed beyond itself to a reality the author intended to communicate. When we insist upon a literal meaning where the author intended symbolism, we risk misunderstanding the message. But there is another ditch waiting on the opposite side of the road. The second ditch is over-symbolizing. This occurs when readers begin treating everything as figurative. Historical events disappear. Concrete realities disappear. Clear statements become endlessly flexible. Before long, nothing means what it plainly says anymore because everything has been transformed into a symbol. That approach is just as dangerous as the first. Because Scripture contains both literal language and symbolic language, the challenge is not choosing one approach and applying it everywhere. The challenge is determining how the author intended the language to function in a particular passage. There is another danger closely related to both of these ditches. I sometimes think of it as the danger of the symbol dictionary. The symbol dictionary approach assumes that every symbol always means exactly the same thing everywhere it appears. A lion always means one thing. A star always means one thing. A mountain always means one thing. But language does not work that way. Let me give you a simple example. A lion can represent the tribe of Judah. A lion can represent strength and courage. A lion can represent a devouring enemy. The image remains the same. The meaning changes with the context. That is why context matters so much. A symbol receives its meaning from the way an author uses it within a specific setting. And this brings us back to one of the most important principles in all of hermeneutics. Context determines meaning. Authorial intent determines meaning. Not our assumptions, not our traditions, not our preferences. The author's intended meaning. That has been the goal from the beginning of this series. Not becoming more literal, not becoming more symbolic, but rather becoming more faithful readers of Scripture. Conclusion. As we conclude this lesson, let's take a moment to review what we have learned. We began by observing that the prophets often communicated through imagery, visions, signs, symbols, and dramatic actions. This was not unusual. It was a normal part of prophetic communication. We then saw that biblical symbols are not invitations to unlimited speculation. Again and again, Scripture provides interpretive guidance. Sometimes the interpretation is explicit. Sometimes it emerges through context, recurring themes, and patterns found elsewhere in Scripture. But in either case, the goal is understanding. We also discovered that symbolic language can communicate literal truth. A symbol is not necessarily less true than a straightforward statement. The symbol points beyond itself to a reality the author intends to communicate. We saw this principle at work in the teachings of Yeshua, in the dreams of Pharaoh, in the visions of Daniel, and throughout the Scriptures. We then examined how easily sincere people can misunderstand language when they assume the wrong type of communication. Nicodemus misunderstood being born again. The woman at the well misunderstood living water. The disciples misunderstood the warning about leaven. In each case, the problem was not hearing the words. The problem was misunderstanding how the words were being used. Finally, we observed that biblical authors often build upon imagery that appears earlier in Scripture. Revelation did not appear in a vacuum. John frequently draws upon a symbolic vocabulary already present in the law, the prophets, and the writings. This is one reason why Scripture is often its own best interpreter. So let me leave you with one final hermeneutics checkpoint. The next time you encounter a symbol in Scripture, stop and ask yourself a few simple questions. Has Scripture already defined this image? Where else does this image appear? What clues does the context provide? How is the author using it here? And perhaps most importantly, am I allowing Scripture to define its own symbols, or am I assigning meanings from my own imagination? The next time you encounter a prophetic passage, don't begin by asking, is this literal? And don't begin by asking, is this symbolic? Begin by asking, how is the author communicating? Because before we can understand what the author meant, we must first understand how the author chose to say it. And that brings us right back to the principle that has guided this lesson from beginning to end. I don't care what it means to me, you, or anyone else. I want to know what it meant to the man who wrote it. In our next study, we will continue building the tools necessary for responsible interpretation as we move deeper into the world of biblical prophecy. End of video 2.